Most people fight for attention. They try to stay visible. They try to be everywhere at once, believing constant presence will make them matter. But the Stoics understood something different. True influence is not measured by applause or recognition. It is measured by the space you occupy in the minds of others, by the echo you leave long after you are gone. Attention fades. Mental space endures. Power is not in the noise you make. It is in the calm you carry, the composure that lingers, the clarity that invites reflection. When you master your thoughts, your reactions, and your energy, you create a presence that cannot be ignored. Silence becomes a signal. Restraint becomes authority. Absence becomes weight. The mind is drawn not to those who shout the loudest, but to those whose impact is felt without demand, whose influence arises naturally from self-mastery. Every interaction, every word, every pause becomes deliberate, and in that deliberation, a quiet, enduring form of power emerges. The moments you leave unfilled by noise are the moments that echo. True presence is felt not because it is demanded, but because it is complete in itself. Calm mastery, measured engagement, and intentional reflection create a magnetic presence that resonates long after you depart. Most people misunderstand presence. They believe influence comes from being seen constantly, responding immediately, or explaining until the silence is gone. Familiarity dulls the mind. When every action is predictable, attention wanes. The Stoics teach that value lies not in endless output, but in deliberate, meaningful contribution. The moments you leave unfilled by noise are the moments that echo. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that it is not what happens to you, but how you react, that matters. And in the spaces we leave, reactions begin to form on their own. The mind craves patterns, yet it thrives on curiosity. When someone is too predictable, interest fades. But when calmness meets insight and restraint meets selective engagement, the brain stays alert. Each subtle shift, each unexpected choice, commands attention naturally. When the brain cannot fully map another person, it invests energy in understanding them, replaying each detail in search of meaning. Controlled mystery invites mental engagement because the mind seeks resolution and, in its search, discovers fascination. Controlled tension is not manipulation, it is intentional restraint. When availability is measured, attention deliberate, and reactions steady, the brain cannot rest. It returns repeatedly to what feels unresolved. Connections deepen not from constant proximity, but from the careful creation of mental space. By mastering internal rhythms and limiting predictability, presence lingers naturally. Influence arises from elevation, not entertainment. The mind is drawn to growth, to environments, to interactions that sharpen focus. When presence inspires reflection or insight, it becomes a reference point. Attention emerges naturally when associated with improvement. Steady, disciplined engagement signals value without assertion. By elevating others, you embed yourself in their reflection. Emotional contrast brings presence to life. Calm steadiness provides safety, but shifts, peaks, and deliberate variation leave lasting memory. A single unexpected insight, a measured response in tension, or a rare moment of intensity becomes a peak the mind recalls again and again. Controlled variation, grounded in inner stability, ensures impact is remembered long after words fade. Timing is subtle power. Leaving a moment while energy is rising leaves a mark. The brain does not forget the unfinished. It loops, replaying the experience internally. By mastering rhythm, when to engage and when to step back, you create mental gravity. Influence is not about prolonging interaction, but preserving impact. If the mind can replay the energy you create, it occupies your space voluntarily rather than by insistence. Neediness diminishes value. When actions are driven by approval or dependence on reaction, the balance shifts. The mind notices vulnerability tied to external validation, and the effect is subtle yet powerful. Influence weakens. True presence emerges from self-containment. Focused attention, clear priorities, and unshakable composure communicate completeness. When others sense your stability without their input, they invest attention not because they must, but because your presence feels rare and chosen. All of this, absence, mystery, contrast, elevation, self-containment, culminates in mental obsession. Influence is not exerted through force or repetition, but through architecture. Each interaction, each pause, each shift in tone and timing creates tension that the mind cannot ignore. The Stoic principle is simple. Mastery over self produces influence over thought. When the mind repeatedly returns to you, when your presence continues to shape reflection even in silence, you exist in the mental space of others. Subscribing is not just support, it is a commitment to your own growth. It is a step toward understanding your mind, cultivating calm mastery, and embracing the discipline that shapes thought, influence, and a life lived intentionally. By choosing to follow this path, you are choosing to occupy your own mental space with clarity, presence, and quiet authority. Timing carries subtle power, leaving a moment while energy rises, ending a conversation before closure, preserves impact. The brain clings to what is incomplete, replaying it in thought and reflection. By responding and withdrawing according to your own rhythm, rather than reacting to external pressures, mental space grows organically. Absence at the right moment amplifies influence because the mind is compelled to fill what is missing. Aristotle noted that the aim of art is to represent not the visible but the invisible, and in the spaces we create, the invisible impression becomes enduring. Dependence diminishes influence. When behavior is driven by the desire for approval, reassurance, or constant validation, value subtly drops. The mind perceives neediness, and with it comes diminished attention. Independence, on the other hand, signals completeness. When your emotional state is self-contained and your priorities clear, engagement is sought rather than expected. By demonstrating self-sufficiency, you shift perception. Presence becomes a choice, not a requirement. Socrates once said that the unexamined life is not worth living, and in choosing internal fullness over external validation, mental space becomes a reflection of conscious design. All of these elements converge to create a persistent presence. Absence, mystery, contrast, elevation, and self-containment combine to form loops of reflection that the mind cannot ignore. Every interaction, pause, and deliberate variation becomes architecture for mental obsession. Influence is not imposed. It emerges from discipline, self-mastery, and the deliberate shaping of experience. The mind craves patterns, but also thrives on mystery. When someone is too predictable, the brain labels them, and interest fades. But when layers are revealed gradually, when calmness follows sharp insight, when restraint meets selective engagement, the mind remains curious. Curiosity is mental energy. It compels attention without force. By allowing yourself to be partially unreadable, you invite reflection, analysis, and mental investment. Each subtle shift in behavior, each unspoken thought, becomes a point of intrigue that the mind cannot ignore. Influence is not built through noise or visibility, but through the quiet architecture of presence. When responses are measured and engagement is intentional, the brain is drawn into loops of attention, replaying each interaction internally. The balance between what is revealed and what is withheld forms tension, and tension creates focus. By maintaining this controlled unpredictability, the mind is compelled to search for patterns that never fully resolve, and in that pursuit, fascination grows. The Stoic understanding reminds us that we cannot control the thoughts of others, only the clarity and discipline of our own actions, and that is the true lever of influence. Subtlety becomes the tool through which mental territory is claimed. When every move is deliberate, every pause considered, the audience of the mind begins to notice. Repetition occurs naturally within their thoughts, not through insistence, but through internal rehearsal. Each conversation, each glance, each carefully placed reaction accumulates weight over time. The mind responds to contrast. Stability alone provides safety, but layered variation creates lasting imprint. A moment of insight following calm reflection, a measured response in tension, a rare display of warmth when distance was expected. These subtle contrasts leave traces that the brain returns to repeatedly. By modulating emotional expression, not through manipulation but through self-mastery, the mind is held in gentle suspense. Elevation of thought fuels engagement as well. When your presence encourages focus, clarity, or growth, the mind associates you with progress. This does not require grand gestures or constant interaction, but the deliberate demonstration of purpose and discipline. Insight offered at the right moment, observation shared with precision, creates a sense of value that is remembered far longer than frequent presence or effortful performance. Timing further amplifies influence. Departing from interaction at the peak of engagement preserves energy and curiosity, leaving the mind looping on the unfinished experience. When engagement is aligned with internal rhythm rather than external pressure, absence becomes presence. Every interaction left unresolved in some measure encourages reflection, anticipation, and mental rehearsal. Aristotle observed that we learn by engaging with what challenges us, and in the careful orchestration of timing and withdrawal, the challenge is sustained internally, drawing the mind back to revisit and reconsider what it has encountered. Dependence on validation diminishes influence. When attention, approval, or acknowledgement is sought too aggressively, value is diminished in subtle ways. The mind instinctively detects imbalance, and the subtle shift in perception reduces engagement. Independence, by contrast, signals completeness. By maintaining self-sufficiency, clarity, and composure, attention is granted voluntarily, and mental space becomes a terrain others choose to inhabit. All elements converge into sustained mental presence. Absence, mystery, contrast, elevation, and independence interact to form a subtle architecture that the mind cannot ignore. Each measured interaction, each deliberate pause, each moment of unpredictability constructs a framework where reflection occurs naturally. Influence is not imposed. It is emergent from discipline, composure, and the thoughtful shaping of experience. Socrates observed that true knowledge exists in knowing what you do not know, and in the deliberate cultivation of partial reveal and internal consistency, the mind is drawn again and again. When others continue to revisit your presence in thought, even in silence, you occupy their mental space without effort, and that quiet, persistent influence becomes enduring. Uncertainty is not chaos. It is controlled tension. People are drawn to what cannot be fully grasped. If every intention, every emotion, every thought is revealed, the mind has nothing to return to. But when your engagement is steady yet measured, when you give enough to connect but leave questions unanswered, mental space forms. The human brain is wired to revisit the unresolved, to return to what feels incomplete. Each interaction that balances clarity with restraint becomes a subtle invitation for reflection. The allure of controlled ambiguity lies in its ability to compel attention without demand. When reactions are intentional and availability is measured, curiosity persists. The mind begins to fill in gaps, seeking patterns, searching for meaning where certainty is withheld. Each pause, each subtle shift, each deliberate restraint acts as a magnet, drawing mental focus inward. The Stoics remind us that self-control is the foundation of influence, and by maintaining measured engagement, you create conditions where interest is earned, sustained, and revisited long after the initial encounter. Influence grows strongest in spaces of reflection. When the mind cannot predict the next action, it remains engaged, replaying previous interactions in search of understanding. By carefully regulating what is revealed and what is withheld, you construct loops of mental attention that operate naturally, without force. The subtle power of timing complements controlled uncertainty. Departing from interaction while energy is rising preserves intrigue and leaves an imprint that endures. The brain holds on to the unfinished, returning repeatedly to reconstruct the experience. By aligning presence with internal rhythm rather than external expectation, absence becomes a tool of influence. Controlled unpredictability is strengthened by the balance of consistency and variation. Your core character remains stable, yet your responses are nuanced, thoughtful, and selective. Calmness may follow intensity, insight may follow restraint, and warmth may appear in moments when distance was expected. This deliberate variation keeps the mind attentive, actively parsing meaning and seeking hidden patterns. The interplay of curiosity and elevation compounds influence. When your presence fosters reflection, growth, or awareness, the mind associates engagement with value. Each observation, each insight, each carefully offered perspective becomes a reference point for thought and assessment. By embodying purpose and demonstrating intentionality, you encourage the mind to prioritize your presence naturally. Aristotle understood that excellence is the result of habit, and in cultivating habits of thoughtful engagement, your impact is internalized, remembered, and sought after, long beyond the initial moment of interaction. Emotional balance strengthens the effect of uncertainty. When your mood, attention, and engagement are self-contained, external reactions fail to disturb your presence. Independence signals completeness and allows others to invest attention freely. The mind notices stability and consistency, and in contrast to its usual need to react and predict, it finds itself drawn inward, replaying subtle cues and revisiting impressions. All of these elements, controlled tension, deliberate ambiguity, timing, nuanced variation, elevation, and self-contained emotion, intertwine to create a presence that occupies thought effortlessly. Each interaction, carefully modulated, forms a scaffold for mental obsession. Repetition occurs naturally in reflection, curiosity compels internal engagement, and absence amplifies significance. Carl Jung observed that what is left unexplored lingers longest in the mind, and in leaving layers intentionally unrevealed, your presence becomes persistent. The mind returns, reconstructs, and engages continuously, not because of demand, but because the architecture of interaction is designed to endure. In the spaces you leave, the mind discovers its own intrigue, and in that silent engagement, influence becomes lasting. Elevate others without seeking acknowledgement. The human mind is drawn to growth, to improvement, to progress. When your presence activates awareness, focus, or inspiration, people associate you with momentum. Influence is strongest not when you entertain, but when you elevate the state of those around you. When your behavior communicates purpose, discipline, and centeredness, it becomes a reference point. By demonstrating consistency in thought and action, the mind begins to prioritize your presence, returning to the impression you leave rather than the noise you produce. Elevation is reinforced by selective engagement. Consistency in values paired with variability in expression encourages mental focus without predictability. The mind notices subtle contrasts, the calm observation amid chaos, the measured word when most would speak hastily, the silent example of discipline in a world of distraction. Each deliberate choice adds weight to your presence, embedding it in the mental frameworks of those who observe or interact with you. The subtlety of influence lies in its unassuming nature. You do not announce your impact, it reveals itself in thought and action. By remaining anchored, purposeful, and composed, your presence encourages the mind to return, to replay insights, and to reflect on the examples you set. The psychological weight of this form of influence surpasses that of attention gained through effort or display. When elevation is paired with consistency of character, it becomes enduring. Repetition of value without monotony reinforces engagement. Each interaction becomes a reference point, a mental marker that the mind revisits when seeking guidance, reflection, or inspiration. By aligning words, actions, and intentions with a disciplined standard, you create a silent authority that is remembered. The Stoics understood that virtue is sufficient for life, and by embodying standards that inspire thought and self-assessment, your influence is embedded in memory rather than merely observed in the moment. Subtle contrasts amplify mental impact. By integrating moments of focused insight with periods of calm observation, you create peaks that the mind cannot easily forget. A single deliberate act, an unexpected display of awareness, or a measured intervention in a moment of uncertainty carries more weight than continuous effort. Presence is remembered not for quantity, but for quality, and the interplay between engagement and restraint deepens mental imprint. Emotional equilibrium enhances elevation. When attention, energy, and engagement are self-contained rather than dependent on external reactions, the mind perceives stability and value. By maintaining composure amid fluctuation, you signal reliability and competence, which invites reflection and repeated attention. Each thoughtful contribution is weighted more heavily because it is not diluted by need or reactive emotion. The culmination of these principles produces persistent influence. By elevating others, creating subtle contrasts, maintaining composure, and demonstrating disciplined purpose, the mind is drawn naturally to revisit your presence. Each interaction, each unspoken lesson, each reflective pause accumulates in memory and thought. Seneca remarked that while we may not control the future, we can control our actions and intentions, and in leaving impressions rooted in value rather than assertion, you occupy mental space with enduring authority. Influence becomes less about recognition and more about the quiet power of being a standard, a reference, and a presence that the mind returns to again and again. Emotional contrast is what makes presence alive. Steadiness provides safety, but variation imprints memory. A single unexpected insight, a moment of calm when tension is expected, a sharp comment when silence is predicted, these shifts create peaks that are recalled again and again. The Stoic ideal here is not emotional manipulation, but self-mastery. Controlled variation, grounded in inner stability, ensures your impact is remembered long after words are forgotten. By allowing emotions to be deliberate rather than reactive, the mind begins to notice, to track, to replay, and to assign significance without force. Influence deepens when contrasts are subtle yet intentional. Calmness paired with insight, humor paired with focus, restraint paired with clarity, these moments create mental peaks that the brain encodes more firmly than constant intensity. It is the interplay of expectation and surprise rather than the volume of energy that holds attention. By allowing variation within a consistent foundation, you create a presence that the mind actively processes, reflecting on your behavior long after the moment passes. The human psyche is wired to notice change, and timing is integral to emotional impact. Steadiness establishes trust, but variation timed precisely, moments of insight appearing after quiet observation, creates resonance. Each shift punctuates attention and signals intentionality. When energy is released thoughtfully and withheld purposefully, the mind invests itself in reconstructing the experience, analyzing tone, and replaying interactions. The effect is subtle, almost imperceptible, but profoundly lasting. Contrast also enhances perceived authenticity. When emotional expression varies naturally according to context, rather than appearing random or excessive, it signals intelligence and self-awareness. Predictable reactions lose their weight, but deliberate shifts convey depth. The mind values signals that are meaningful and rare, and each calculated variation becomes a marker of thoughtfulness. Influence through contrast is magnified when paired with selective attention. Not every interaction requires intensity. Measured engagement ensures that when emotional peaks appear, they stand out. By calibrating involvement according to context, the mind becomes attuned to subtleties it might otherwise overlook. The impact of these interactions is amplified because they are consciously limited, not diluted by constant display. Subtle variation fosters curiosity. When behaviors shift within a consistent framework, the mind searches for patterns, attempting to reconcile expectation with observation. Each deviation prompts reflection, replay, and analysis. The engagement is voluntary, internal, and self-sustained. By controlling contrast without exaggeration, you allow attention to flourish naturally. Emotional contrast also strengthens memory through association. Peaks in attention, moments of tension followed by calm, or insight interspersed with quiet reflection are encoded more deeply than monotony. The mind links these experiences to significance, creating mental markers that persist. By presenting variability with deliberation and self-mastery, you encourage others to replay interactions internally, extending the influence beyond the immediate encounter. Finally, the combination of steadiness and variation creates enduring impact. The mind does not merely witness, it engages, analyzes, and recalls. Each carefully timed insight, each deliberate shift in demeanor, each controlled expression becomes part of the cognitive map others hold of you. Influence is subtle, earned through thoughtful presence rather than force or intensity. Epictetus taught that we are disturbed not by what happens to us, but by our judgments, and in regulating emotional expression with awareness, you create a presence that is reflected upon, remembered, and returned to again and again. In this careful balance, your presence is alive, memorable, and mentally unavoidable. Timing is subtle power. Leaving too early or too late can distort perception, but ending a moment while energy is rising leaves a mark. The brain does not forget the unfinished. It loops, replaying the experience internally. By mastering rhythm, when to engage and when to step back, you create mental gravity. Influence is not about prolonging interaction, but preserving impact. Each carefully measured pause allows reflection to deepen, and each deliberate withdrawal invites the mind to reconstruct the experience with interest and focus. The mind holds tension in what is unresolved. By stepping back at the peak, you allow anticipation to take root. The absence is not emptiness. It is space for reflection, curiosity, and continued engagement. Each interaction is layered, not linear, allowing the observer to revisit, analyze, and mentally replay the energy you produced. Influence is less about continuous engagement and more about leaving residue in thought. Rhythm becomes an instrument of subtle authority. The predictability of constant presence dulls attention, while well-timed engagement elevates perception. By choosing when to contribute and when to withdraw, you signal control, composure, and confidence without saying a word. Each moment of interaction becomes a cue the brain holds onto, encoding significance in absence as much as in presence. The Stoic understanding reminds us that mastery over self is more powerful than mastery over circumstance, and in this disciplined pacing, mental attention is captured naturally, voluntarily, and repeatedly. Absence enhances value, but only when paired with intention. The mind senses when engagement is purposeful rather than automatic. Moments of withdrawal at the right time allow impressions to consolidate, strengthening the memory of your presence. Controlled timing transforms ordinary exchanges into events that linger mentally. Carl Jung observed that the psyche returns persistently to what is unresolved, and by leaving space for reflection, your interactions embed themselves in thought, creating loops of attention that extend beyond the immediate moment. The subtle art of timing also heightens curiosity. By not providing every answer, every reaction, or every gesture immediately, you compel the mind to fill the gaps, search for patterns, and anticipate your next movement. Each interval becomes fertile ground for mental engagement, allowing influence to persist without force. The human brain is drawn to what is incomplete, and in orchestrating timing with precision, each pause amplifies the impact of presence. Seneca taught that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, and by allowing anticipation to shape perception, the mind invests itself freely in reconstructing the interaction. Timing interacts with emotional contrast to deepen engagement. A measured pause following intensity allows the mind to retain the peak, while a calm moment after tension encourages reflection. By alternating focus and withdrawal, excitement and tranquility, the memory of interaction is layered, nuanced, and durable. The brain prioritizes these peaks over monotony, encoding significance in the gaps between extremes. Consistency in character combined with variability in access creates mental tension that strengthens influence. The brain notices not just what is presented, but what is withheld, analyzing gaps, assessing patterns, and returning to the unresolved. By calibrating timing with deliberate restraint, the mind learns to value engagement when it occurs, not merely expect it. Ultimately, influence is secured not through constant presence, but through the thoughtful orchestration of engagement and absence. By stepping back while energy remains high, you preserve the emotional peak and allow reflection to take hold. The mind revisits, replays, and reinvests attention voluntarily. Neediness diminishes value. When actions are driven by approval or dependence on reaction, the balance shifts. The mind notices vulnerability tied to external validation, and the effect is subtle yet powerful. Influence weakens. True presence emerges from self-containment. Focused attention, clear priorities, and unshakable composure communicate completeness. By centering your energy internally rather than seeking confirmation externally, you signal stability and authority without force. The perception of independence intensifies influence. When attention is not demanded, when engagement is given selectively and without urgency, the mind begins to value what is available more highly. Absence becomes weight, and measured presence gains significance. By maintaining composure while others' reactions fluctuate, you transform every interaction into a choice for the observer rather than an obligation. The subtle signal of self-sufficiency draws focus naturally, prompting reflection and curiosity. Confidence rooted in self-mastery conveys authority more effectively than insistence ever could. When priorities are clear and focus unwavering, others sense that your presence is complete without their input. The mind is drawn to stability and decisiveness, interpreting composure as competence and weight. By avoiding reactive behavior and refraining from seeking approval, you create a psychological environment where attention is earned, not assumed. Seneca reminded that a wise person does not depend on others for their virtue, and in demonstrating internal sufficiency, influence arises naturally and enduringly. Selective engagement amplifies mental presence. When you participate thoughtfully rather than continuously, every interaction carries significance. The brain encodes these interactions more deeply because they are infrequent yet meaningful. By stepping back while maintaining intentionality, you create mental loops that the observer revisits repeatedly. Each pause, each measured contribution, and each deliberate silence reinforces the sense of scarcity and value. Freedom from emotional dependency creates subtle magnetism. When reactions are self-contained and composure remains intact under pressure, observers perceive strength without effort. The mind responds to calm authority, returning repeatedly to assess and interpret the signals it receives. By maintaining a centered presence, every word, gesture, and pause carries unspoken weight. The absence of need encourages voluntary investment. When others recognize that your attention is not guaranteed, the mind begins to fill gaps with reflection and anticipation. Controlled detachment increases psychological pull, creating attention that naturally draws focus. Each interaction leaves residue, and the brain rehearses impressions internally, reinforcing the impact over time. Carl Jung remarked that people are attracted to what challenges them to think, and in showing self-sufficiency, you challenge attention to engage actively rather than passively. Independence enhances value when combined with subtle accessibility. By being available selectively without overexposure or overcommitment, you position yourself as rare and consequential. The observer's mind begins to allocate energy to understanding, analyzing, and anticipating your next move. This dynamic creates cognitive engagement that persists even in your absence. Ultimately, influence rests not on demand, but on the architecture of presence. Neediness, constant reassurance, and visible dependence dilute mental impact, while internal sufficiency, composure, and selective engagement strengthen it. The mind returns to what is perceived as complete, balanced, and intentionally positioned. All of this, absence, mystery, contrast, elevation, self-containment, culminates in mental obsession. Influence is not exerted through force or repetition, but through architecture. Each interaction, each pause, each shift in tone and timing creates tension that the mind cannot ignore. By orchestrating presence with intention, you allow thought to follow rather than demand it. The brain returns naturally to what is unresolved, replaying subtle cues, reconstructing interactions, and filling in gaps with reflection. When the mind revisits your presence repeatedly, reflection becomes habitual. The echoes of your actions and words gain weight not through volume, but through subtlety and structure. Each pause and each measured reveal contributes to an internal narrative that the observer cannot complete, prompting repeated mental engagement. By leaving space for interpretation, for curiosity, and for thought, you create a persistent mental imprint. Presence achieved through internal mastery communicates more than action alone. The mind does not merely observe, it analyzes, reconstructs, and invests in the layers it cannot fully know. By combining restraint, timing, and subtle contrast, each interaction becomes a reference point for thought, a marker the brain returns to voluntarily. The effect is cumulative, building an internal gravitational pull that draws attention naturally. Every measured engagement reinforces the perception of value. When interactions are purposeful but not excessive, the mind perceives them as significant. Absence is no longer emptiness. It becomes weight, a signal that the mind fills with reflection. Controlled revelation, paired with composure, signals completeness, making attention voluntary rather than compelled. Seneca taught that it is not what we endure in life, but how we endure it, that determines our strength. And by enduring interactions with intention and consistency, you create influence that persists quietly yet powerfully in thought. The interplay of scarcity and reflection amplifies mental presence. When exposure is selective, the brain begins to prioritize engagement, replaying cues, analyzing tone, and reflecting on meaning. Each subtle variation reinforces significance, encouraging internal loops of focus and anticipation. By structuring presence like architecture rather than noise, you allow attention to invest itself naturally. Emotional balance underpins enduring influence. The mind responds to stability combined with occasional contrast, encoding moments of insight more deeply than continuous intensity. By maintaining composure while allowing variation, the mental imprint of interaction strengthens, reinforcing voluntary reflection. Timing remains a subtle yet critical amplifier of influence, departing interactions at moments of peak energy, pausing when engagement rises, and maintaining rhythm rather than reacting to external cues preserves impact and enhances mental resonance. Each calculated interval encourages anticipation, reflection, and cognitive rehearsal. Marcus Aurelius reflected that we are shaped more by our thoughts than by events themselves, And by controlling timing intentionally, you embed influence in thought rather than through insistence, allowing presence to persist naturally within the observer's mind. Ultimately, mental obsession is created through the disciplined orchestration of absence, curiosity, contrast, elevation, and self-containment. Influence arises quietly, persistently, and internally, shaping thought without force or demand. Each interaction, pause, and nuanced variation constructs a framework in which the mind voluntarily returns, reflecting, replaying, and reinforcing significance. Influence is not created solely through what you say or do, but through the spaces you intentionally leave. Each pause, each moment of silence carries weight when the mind is attuned to presence. When you allow reflection to occupy these spaces, mental attention becomes active rather than passive. The observer begins to revisit impressions, reconstruct interactions, and assign meaning without your intervention. By orchestrating these intervals thoughtfully, you create an invisible structure that the mind cannot resist exploring. Marcus Aurelius reminded that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, and by curating the rhythm and depth of presence, you subtly shape how others think and feel long after interaction. The subtle power of observation strengthens this influence. By witnessing moments without immediate reaction, by engaging selectively rather than constantly, you invite internal processing. The mind notices patterns and deviations, contrasts and consistencies, and begins to invest attention in understanding the reasoning behind each measured choice. This form of influence is quiet but persistent, compelling reflection through perception rather than insistence. Mental engagement is further deepened when presence is linked to insight. Subtle guidance, thoughtful commentary, or a well-timed observation allows the mind to associate your presence with clarity and understanding. Each interaction then becomes a reference point, a marker the observer revisits to interpret new experiences through the lens of your influence. Consistency in principles reinforces authority. When your actions and responses reflect steady values, the mind recognizes reliability amidst uncertainty. This stability, combined with subtle variation, signals mastery and intentionality, capturing attention while allowing curiosity to flourish. The mind invests in patterns that are meaningful, yet not entirely predictable. Timing and rhythm continue to amplify influence when paired with emotional equilibrium. Responding with measured intensity, stepping back when energy peaks, and remaining composed under pressure ensures that mental engagement persists. By controlling when and how energy is expressed, the mind constructs a narrative in which your presence is significant, scarce, and consequential. Marcus Aurelius reflected that our life is what our thoughts make it, and in regulating emotional and temporal cadence, you shape not only interaction, but perception, leaving an imprint that the mind repeatedly returns to. Elevation through example strengthens this effect. When presence inspires focus, discipline, or reflection, the observer associates engagement with growth and improvement. Influence is no longer forced, it becomes internally generated. By demonstrating clarity, purpose, and thoughtful action, you encourage the mind to prioritize attention voluntarily. Scarcity magnifies value. When attention is not guaranteed, when engagement is limited yet deliberate, the mind allocates energy selectively. Absence becomes meaningful, and each interaction carries additional weight because it is anticipated rather than assumed. The brain invests itself in reconstructing experiences, replaying moments, and projecting what may come next. Plato observed that wonder is the beginning of thought, and by allowing scarcity to guide engagement, you invite curiosity that compels reflection and reinforces persistent attention. All of these elements, absence, mystery, contrast, elevation, self-containment, insight, consistency, timing, and scarcity, interweave to produce mental obsession. Influence is created through careful architecture rather than force or repetition. Each pause, each shift in tone, each measured reveal contributes to loops of thought the observer cannot resist. When the mind repeatedly returns to you, reflecting on what was seen, heard, or felt, you exist not just in interaction, but in mental space itself. Carl Jung observed that the mind is drawn to what challenges it, and in mastering the deliberate construction of presence, your influence persists, enduring in thought far beyond any direct engagement. The quiet power of presence is strengthened when every action is intentional and every engagement purposeful. Influence emerges not from constant input, but from the subtle ways you shape perception and reflection. When each word, gesture, or pause is deliberate, the mind begins to track meaning, anticipate patterns, and revisit impressions on its own. This creates a form of mental gravity that draws attention without demand. Every interaction becomes more than communication. It becomes a cognitive impression. By providing insight, demonstrating consistency, and allowing space for reflection, the observer is invited to engage internally. The mind reconstructs each moment, filling in gaps, analyzing tone, and replaying subtle cues. This internal rehearsal creates a persistent connection that is far stronger than anything forced externally. Marcus Aurelius reminded that the obstacle becomes the way, and by allowing space for the mind to navigate and interpret your presence, you create influence that endures quietly yet powerfully. Influence deepens when emotional composure is paired with occasional, intentional contrast. Moments of calm amidst intensity, insight amidst observation, or restraint amidst expectation capture attention more effectively than constant stimulation. These peaks and valleys are encoded more deeply in memory and thought, creating mental markers that the observer returns to voluntarily. The perception of independence magnifies influence further. When your engagement is not contingent on approval, when reactions are self-contained rather than reactive, attention is granted freely rather than demanded. The mind instinctively recognizes stability and completeness, and in observing measured autonomy, it begins to revisit and reconstruct interactions internally. Timing and rhythm continue to shape mental engagement, stepping back at moments of rising energy, pausing during reflection, and entering at precise intervals allow interactions to leave enduring impressions. The brain holds tension in unresolved experiences and reconstructs them in thought repeatedly. By mastering the cadence of presence, you orchestrate attention without explicit effort, letting influence extend beyond the moment. Selective engagement enhances the potency of presence. When attention is given sparingly but with precision, every interaction becomes meaningful. The mind tracks patterns, assesses significance, and returns voluntarily to what is deemed valuable. Each interaction becomes a reference point, and anticipation grows in the absence of constant engagement. Plato wrote that knowledge begins in wonder, and by offering presence in ways that provoke reflection, you create curiosity that encourages repeated mental focus, reinforcing the impression of depth and significance. Subtle cues of elevation solidify long-term influence. When your presence inspires clarity, insight, or improvement, attention becomes internally motivated. Observers associate engagement with progress and reflection rather than obligation. By embodying purpose, discipline, and thoughtful action, you create a standard that others mentally return to repeatedly. Marcus Aurelius reflected that the universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it, and by structuring interactions with deliberate elevation, your presence leaves enduring mental traces that persist long after direct interaction. Ultimately, mental obsession is the product of deliberate architecture, not force. Absence, mystery, contrast, timing, emotional composure, selective engagement, and elevation converge to create loops of thought the mind cannot resist. Each pause, each nuanced shift, and each intentionally withheld response strengthens presence, embedding influence in reflection rather than reaction. Epictetus reminded that true freedom comes from mastery over self rather than circumstance. And in mastering your presence, you occupy the mental space of others naturally, becoming both remembered and unavoidable, a subtle force that endures beyond any visible engagement. The subtle power of influence extends beyond what is said or done. It resides in the way presence lingers, in the pauses between action, and in the space left for reflection. When interaction is measured and deliberate, the mind begins to engage voluntarily, reconstructing moments internally and assigning significance without prompting. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully considered word contributes to an invisible architecture of attention. Influence becomes a byproduct of intention rather than effort, and the observer finds themselves returning mentally, not because they are compelled, but because the structure of interaction encourages thought. In this way, presence is cultivated as a quiet force, persistent and enduring, shaping perception and thought without intrusion. The mind responds to patterns, but it thrives on tension between expectation and subtle variation. When reactions are predictable, interest fades. When they are intentional yet measured, attention deepens. The deliberate rhythm of engagement creates mental loops where thought reconstructs interaction repeatedly, drawing focus naturally and silently. By balancing consistency with subtle shifts, influence is internalized, becoming part of the observer's reflection rather than a surface-level impression. Every moment of presence, every carefully modulated expression reinforces significance and builds cognitive investment, creating a sense of weight that persists beyond the immediate exchange. Scarcity and anticipation amplify the effect of influence. When engagement is limited but meaningful, the mind allocates energy selectively, replaying interactions in thought, analyzing cues, and projecting outcomes. Absence becomes a tool of reflection, not a void, and every measured moment gains value. Each pause allows for internal rehearsal, strengthening the impression of significance without overt effort. By cultivating intentional gaps and controlling the flow of presence, you guide attention without insistence, allowing the observer to invest mentally in the experience, reinforcing both memory and attachment over time. Emotional balance enhances the persistence of presence. Controlled variation, alternating moments of focus with pauses, intensity with calm, allows the mind to encode experiences more deeply. Peaks and valleys in engagement create mental markers that are revisited voluntarily, reinforcing significance and maintaining interest. By remaining composed while demonstrating selective expression, you communicate mastery without force, allowing attention to become invested in thought rather than demanded externally. Each deliberate shift, each measured moment of engagement, compounds over time to strengthen mental presence and cultivate reflection that persists beyond immediate observation. Timing and rhythm are crucial in amplifying influence. Engaging when appropriate, withdrawing at the right moment, and structuring interaction around intention preserves impact and encourages reflection. The brain retains tension in moments left unresolved, returning repeatedly to analyze and interpret cues. When interactions are paced with awareness and subtlety, attention is maintained naturally, and the observer's mind is guided toward reflection. The strategic orchestration of presence, both in engagement and absence, constructs cognitive patterns that reinforce influence internally, allowing your impact to extend beyond visible participation. Selective engagement deepens cognitive investment. By participating thoughtfully with intentionality and limitation, each interaction carries significance that the mind encodes and revisits. Anticipation grows in response to the measured allocation of attention, and the observer actively invests mental energy in understanding and interpreting subtle cues. The dynamic created by thoughtful engagement encourages repeated reflection, internal rehearsal, and prolonged attention, transforming ordinary exchanges into enduring mental impressions. Presence becomes a standard against which the mind continually evaluates new experiences, reinforcing attention and significance organically over time. All of these elements, absence, mystery, contrast, timing, emotional balance, selective engagement and elevation, combine to produce enduring influence. Each interaction, each pause, each deliberate expression, and each carefully constructed moment contributes to mental loops that the observer cannot ignore. Influence is no longer imposed. It emerges naturally through reflection, anticipation, and internal engagement. By orchestrating presence with intention and discipline, you create a space in which your impact continues to resonate long after visible interaction ends, occupying thought and shaping perception in ways that endure quietly, subtly, and persistently. Presence is reinforced by the subtle art of restraint. Influence grows when the mind senses intention rather than compulsion, when each word, gesture, or action is measured and purposeful. By limiting exposure and choosing engagement thoughtfully, the mind begins to invest attention voluntarily, replaying interactions, analyzing nuance, and reflecting on significance. Each pause or unspoken moment becomes part of an internal narrative, a cognitive echo that amplifies your impact without effort. In this way, the architecture of presence is constructed quietly, relying on deliberate choices rather than continuous display to embed influence deeply and persistently. The mind is drawn to depth, not to noise. Repetition of meaningful interactions reinforces attention, while overexposure diminishes it. By curating what is revealed and what remains intentionally withheld, you guide reflection, creating loops of thought that return naturally to your presence. Each subtle variation in behavior, tone, or timing encourages mental engagement, sustaining curiosity and focus over time. Consistency in principles, paired with controlled unpredictability, allows the mind to invest without instruction or demand, making influence a product of design rather than force. Anticipation becomes a tool of engagement. When responses are not guaranteed, the mind allocates attention more selectively, replaying moments to assess significance and predict future patterns. Absence, when balanced with deliberate presence, intensifies curiosity and reinforces mental investment. Each measured interaction builds a rhythm of expectation, drawing thought back to what is meaningful and sparking reflection in silence. In creating space for anticipation, attention is no longer a passive observation, but an active cognitive process that reinforces the impression of depth and value. Elevation strengthens persistence when paired with subtle challenge. By inspiring reflection, thought, or insight without direct imposition, you associate presence with growth. The mind begins to prioritize interaction that carries significance, returning to cues, reconstructing meaning, and evaluating patterns. Deliberate action and purposeful behavior create internal markers that the observer tracks mentally. Influence becomes self-sustaining, emerging from the architecture of experience rather than from repeated effort, as the brain continually references and reflects on moments of insight and intentionality. Contrast enhances memorability. Alternating focus, intensity, and restraint captures attention more effectively than monotony. Peaks and valleys in engagement create mental markers that the brain encodes, replaying them voluntarily over time. By presenting deliberate variation, you communicate mastery and depth without explicit instruction, allowing the mind to invest freely in reflection. Each nuanced shift adds weight, reinforcing significance and maintaining engagement without effort. Presence becomes remembered through the interplay of stability and change, subtle yet compelling. Timing amplifies influence by shaping perception. Engaging when appropriate and withdrawing at peak moments preserves energy, tension, and interest. The mind retains unresolved experiences and revisits them repeatedly, constructing a cognitive loop that sustains attention. By orchestrating rhythm in interaction, balancing participation with absence, you guide thought naturally, allowing the observer to internalize impressions. Strategic timing ensures that influence persists quietly, forming lasting patterns of reflection that reinforce attention long after direct engagement has ended. Subtlety in action reinforces authority. Influence is strengthened when behavior is purposeful, composure is maintained, and engagement is deliberate rather than reactive. The observer senses stability, completeness, and intentionality, which draws attention without overt assertion. By curating exposure, guiding reflection, and managing presence, you embed significance in thought rather than relying on visible performance. Each measured action, pause, or shift becomes part of an internal narrative that the mind returns to repeatedly, amplifying mental impact and solidifying enduring influence. Ultimately, enduring influence emerges from the interplay of presence, restraint, timing, contrast, and intentional engagement. Every deliberate pause, every measured reveal, and every subtle variation contributes to loops of thought that the observer cannot ignore. Influence arises naturally through reflection, anticipation, and internalized attention, rather than through compulsion or constant visibility. By orchestrating these elements thoughtfully, you create a presence that occupies mental space quietly yet persistently, shaping perception, sustaining engagement, and leaving an imprint that endures long beyond visible interaction. Your presence is your quiet power. The moments you shape, the space you leave, the tension you create, they echo in thought long after you are gone. Influence is not in demand, it is in mastery. Carry it with intention, and the mind will return to you on its own. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. If you want to continue sharpening your mind and deepening your understanding of presence, click on one of the videos on the screen and keep building the mastery of thought that shapes your world.